Clara had always considered herself a practical woman. She was a retired schoolteacher, known for her steady hands and even steadier nerves. But lately, her little apartment in a quiet New England town had turned into the epicenter of something she couldn't explain. It began subtly. The gas stove would light itself, the kitchen faucet would turn on and off as if by an unseen hand, and the lights flickered in patterns that felt deliberate, almost playful. She tried chalking it up to faulty wiring, aging pipes, or maybe even her own imagination. But today, the bizarre events took a turn she couldn't ignore. It started with her favorite teacup, a delicate porcelain piece painted with roses that had been her grandmother's. She was holding it as she prepared her afternoon tea, a ritual that gave her comfort. Out of nowhere, the cup slipped from her grasp, except it didn't fall. It flew, as if propelled by an invisible force, straight toward the open kitchen window. Clara stood frozen, watching as the cup sailed through the air and out into the quiet street below. She heard a muffled exclamation and a thud. Running to the window, she saw a man in a work jumpsuit bending to pick up the shattered pieces of her beloved teacup. His expression was a mixture of surprise and amusement as he looked up at her. "You okay up there?" he called out, his voice tinged with a New England twang. Clara flushed with embarrassment. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened. It just slipped out of my hands." The man straightened, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. "No harm done, ma'am. Guess I'm lucky it wasn't a flower pot, huh?" He grinned, brushing shards of porcelain off his boots. Clara stepped back from the window and hurried to the front door. By the time she opened it, the man was already climbing the porch steps, carrying the broken pieces in his hand. "Here you go," he said, offering them to her. "I'm Mike. I'm the electrician you called." "Oh, of course," Clara said, suddenly remembering the flickering lights that had prompted her call. She took the fragments of her cup with a sigh. "Thank you, Mike. And I'm so sorry again about this. It's been a strange day." Mike gave her a knowing look, the kind that made Clara feel as though he had heard such stories before. "Strange, huh? Well, I've seen my share of weird stuff in old houses like this. Probably just some loose wires or a bad circuit. Mind if I take a look around?" Clara hesitated, her instincts warring with her embarrassment. Should she tell him about the faucet? The stove? The inexplicable drafts that seemed to come and go like whispers? Finally, she nodded. "Yes, please. I'd appreciate it." Mike set down his toolbox and began his inspection, starting with the breaker box in the small laundry room. Clara hovered nearby, unsure whether to offer him coffee or leave him to his work. She settled for watching quietly as he tested wires and checked connections. "Everything looks normal so far," he said after a few minutes, "but I'll check the outlets and fixtures, just to be sure." As he moved through the apartment, Clara's unease grew. The air felt charged, almost electric, as if the room itself was holding its breath. She rubbed her arms, trying to shake the feeling. "You ever had issues like this before?" Mike asked, glancing at her as he removed the cover from a light switch. "Not until recently," Clara admitted. "It started a few weeks ago. Little things at first, but now it's like the whole apartment has a mind of its own." Mike chuckled softly. "I've heard stories like that. Usually turns out to be something simple. Bad wiring, a power surge, maybe even a rodent chewing through cables. I'll figure it out." Clara tried to smile, but her thoughts were racing. Was it really just faulty wiring, or was there something else at play? She'd always dismissed the idea of ghosts or hauntings as superstitious nonsense, but now she wasn't so sure. As Mike worked, she found herself glancing at the shadows in the corners of the room. Were they moving, or was it just her imagination? The sound of Mike's tools provided a reassuring rhythm, but it wasn't enough to dispel the creeping dread that had settled over her. "Hey, Mrs. Crawford," Mike's voice pulled her from her thoughts. "Just Clara," she corrected him automatically. "What is it?" He held up a charred wire. The insulation melted away to reveal the blackened copper beneath. "Found part of your problem. This wire's been fried. Could be a surge or maybe just old age. I'll replace it for you, but I'd recommend getting the whole system checked out soon." Clara nodded, but her eyes drifted to the window, where the afternoon light was fading into a dusky orange. She felt a shiver run down her spine. Something told her that a burnt wire wasn't the end of her troubles. In fact, it might just be the beginning. Moments after Clara's teacup met its untimely demise, Mike stood at her front door, toolbox in hand. Clara opened it quickly, still flustered by the incident but determined to appear composed. "Come on in," she said, stepping aside. Mike nodded, stepping into the cozy yet slightly cluttered living room. He paused just inside the doorway, scanning the space with a peculiar intensity. His eyes darted to the corners, the shadows cast by the late afternoon sun, and even the ceiling. Clara's stomach tightened as she watched him. "You sure you live here alone?" Mike asked, his voice low, almost cautious. The question startled her. "Of course I'm alone. Why do you ask?" Mike's gaze lingered on the far corner of the room where an old rocking chair swayed gently, though no one had touched it. "Because," he said, his tone grave, "something tells me you're not." A chill ran down Clara's spine. Her first thought was that Mike had lost his mind, but the seriousness in his expression made her hesitate. I don't understand. What do you mean?" she stammered. Mike set his toolbox down and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I've been doing this a long time, ma'am. I've seen things, weird things. And this house?" He gestured vaguely around the room. "This place feels crowded." Clara's mouth went dry. "Crowded? Yeah," Mike said, stepping deeper into the room. He moved with the deliberate caution of someone walking through a minefield. "You've got energy in here. Residual, maybe. Or something more active. Ever hear of a poltergeist?" Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. "A poltergeist? You can't be serious. Those are just stories. Myths." "Most of the time, sure," Mike said with a shrug. "But sometimes there's truth to those myths. And I'm telling you, there's something off about this place. Lights don't flicker like that for no reason. Cups don't fly out of people's hands by themselves." Clara opened her mouth to argue but stopped. Deep down, she knew he was right. The strange occurrences had started weeks ago, and they were only getting worse. But a poltergeist? It sounded ridiculous. "Okay, let's say for a moment that you're not completely insane," she said, folding her arms. "What am I supposed to do about it?" Mike smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted at experience, and maybe a little resignation. "First, you let me take a look around, then we figure out what we're dealing with." Before Clara could respond, Mike turned toward the hallway. "Mind if I check the rest of the house?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Go ahead. But I'm telling you, there's nothing here, just old furniture and creaky floors." Mike didn't answer. He retrieved a small bag from his toolbox and slung it over his shoulder. "Stay here. I'll call if I find anything." Clara watched him disappear down the hallway, her unease growing with each passing second. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. She perched on the edge of the sofa, gripping her hands together to keep them from shaking. A sudden creak echoed from the direction Mike had gone. Clara's breath caught. She leaned forward, straining to hear. "Mike?" she called. No response. She stood and took a tentative step toward the hallway. Just as she reached the doorway, Mike reappeared, startling her. "Sorry," he said quickly, raising a hand. "Didn't mean to scare you." "Find anything?" Clara asked, her voice tighter than she intended. Mike hesitated, then held up a small object. It was a pendant, tarnished silver with a strange, intricate design etched into its surface. "Found this under the bed in the guest room," he said. "You recognize it?" Clara shook her head. "No. I've never seen that before." Mike frowned, turning the pendant over in his hand. "Doesn't look like something you'd just forget about. It's old, and it's got energy." Clara's pulse quickened. "Energy? What does that even mean?" "It means," Mike said, his voice dropping, "this thing might be tied to what's happening here. Could be the source, or it could just be attracting whatever's causing the trouble." Clara stared at the pendant, unease coiling in her stomach. She didn't want to believe him, but the evidence was mounting. "What do we do with it?" she asked finally. Mike slipped the pendant into a small pouch and tied it shut. "For now, we keep it safe. I'll do some research, see if I can figure out where it came from. In the meantime, try to stay calm. Don't antagonize anything." Clara blinked. "Antagonize? You make it sound like this. Thing can think." Mike's expression was grim. "Sometimes it can." The room seemed to grow colder. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, glancing at the shadows that seemed to grow darker by the minute. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. "Look, I know this is a lot," Mike said, his voice softer now, "but we'll get to the bottom of it. I promise. Clara nodded, though she didn't feel reassured. As Mike packed up his tools and prepared to leave, she couldn't help but wonder if she'd made a mistake letting him into her home. Because now, more than ever, it felt like she wasn't alone. The man asked Clara to leave the apartment for a while. Clara returned home feeling slightly worn out after a long day. Her backpack hung over one shoulder, and her mind was racing with questions about what to do next. When she opened the door to her apartment, she froze. Michael was standing in the middle of the living room, holding something strange in his hands, an odd contraption resembling a vacuum cleaner, but far more intricate. Its surface was transparent, and Clara could see peculiar mechanisms inside, gently shifting, almost as if they were alive and searching for an escape. "Open all the windows." His voice was calm but firm, carrying the kind of authority you'd expect from a seasoned captain steering through a storm. Clara stared at him, puzzled. Her first instinct was to walk out and shut the door behind her. But there was something about Michael's presence, his steady movements, his unshakable demeanor, that made her pause. It wasn't threatening, but it demanded attention. She thought back to all the strange events she'd experienced recently, unexplainable and escalating. This wasn't the time for skepticism. Swallowing her hesitation, she walked over to the nearest window. With a sigh, she flung it open, feeling the crisp evening air sweep into the room. The breeze carried the scent of rain and snow, as if nature itself anticipated something unusual. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Michael nodded but said nothing. His focus was entirely on the device, his hands making quick adjustments to its dials. The room felt heavier, the tension almost tangible, like the calm before a storm. Suddenly, Michael powered on the machine, and the room was enveloped in an eerie silence. Then, out of nowhere, strange entities began to appear. Dust-like creatures rolled across the floor and walls, moving as if they had a will of their own. They were about the size of large dogs, with glowing red eyes and jagged mouths that shimmered like steel blades. Clara froze in terror as the creatures emerged from the corners, from beneath furniture, and even from cracks in the walls. Her instinct was to scream, but she clasped her hand over her mouth. These weren't ordinary intruders. They were something else. One particularly large creature slithered out of the shadows, its sharp, grinding teeth echoing through the room. It locked its glowing eyes on Clara, and a shiver ran down her spine. Just as it began to lunge toward her, Michael cranked up the device's power. The vacuum roared to life, vibrating as it started pulling the creatures toward its transparent chamber. The dust beasts screeched, resisting with every ounce of their strange energy, their forms flickering as if caught between dimensions. "This isn't just dust," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "No, it's not." Michael replied without looking at her. His voice was calm, but his muscles were tense. "This is something ancient, something that doesn't belong here." The creatures clawed at the floor and walls, trying to escape the pull of the machine. One managed to break free, crashing into the wall before Michael adjusted the vacuum settings. With a loud hiss, it was finally sucked into the chamber. Clara couldn't believe what she was witnessing. This wasn't just cleaning, this was a battle, and Michael was fighting it with the determination of someone who had done this before. "Is this thing safe?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the machine's hum. Michael glanced at her, a faint smirk on his face. "Safe isn't the word I'd use. Effective? Sure." The vacuum began to hum louder, its mechanisms glowing as the last of the creatures were pulled inside. The room grew colder, and the air felt charged with an unnatural energy. When the final creature disappeared into the machine, the silence was deafening. Michael powered it down and stood still, his breathing steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. "What the hell was that?" Clara finally managed to say, her voice shaking. Michael looked at her, his expression unreadable. "That was just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" Michael's eyes darkened. "We didn't just get rid of them. We opened something bigger. And now we have to deal with it." Clara felt a chill run through her, deeper than anything she'd felt before. She realized with growing dread that her world would never be the same. An hour had passed, yet Michael was still fighting the same creatures that kept crawling out of the apartment's corners. as if the walls themselves were trying to hold them back. They resembled dust balls with eyes filled with rage and razor-sharp teeth that gleamed eerily in the dim light. Michael wasted no time. His vacuum wasn't just sucking them up, it was consuming their very essence, forcing them to vanish. But each new ball of dust was like a threat that needed to be neutralized. Clara stood frozen against the wall, her eyes fixed on the chaotic scene. Her body was paralyzed with fear, and though she knew she should help, her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. It all felt like a terrible dream. Her hands trembled, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. Time dragged on endlessly, and she couldn't believe she was part of something so horrifying and strange. Michael was the only one who seemed to understand how to stop this nightmare. And she just stood there, transfixed. Every time the vacuum roared to life with a deep, humming sound, Clara could feel the world around her losing its shape. Right before her eyes, more creatures emerged from the shadows, as if the entire universe had been cloaked in a dark, malevolent fog. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the last dusty monster was sucked into the machine and the tension in the air eased slightly. Michael switched off the vacuum and silence fell over the room. It felt like a small victory in a much larger war. Clara exhaled sharply, her shaky hands still unable to steady themselves. She rushed to the window, forcing herself to follow Michael's instructions. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, as if the world was on the verge of collapse. But strangely, as she shut the window, the space around her seemed to snap back into place. Everything looked as it had before, normal. The only thing betraying the chaos that had just unfolded was her ragged breathing. "It's done," she whispered, though Michael didn't seem ready to rest. He slumped into a chair, wiping sweat from his brow, but his posture remained alert. His eyes still held that sharp, unrelenting focus, though his shoulders sagged from exhaustion. Clara stood a few steps away, her body still buzzing with anxiety. Now that the fear had slightly subsided, she could finally ask the one question that had been burning in her mind. What the hell was that? Her voice was low and shaky, but beneath the fear, there was growing curiosity. Michael turned to her, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion but still brimming with determination. He took a deep breath, as if preparing to explain something monumental. "They're entities," he said, his gaze never leaving her. "What you saw, those aren't just figments of imagination. They're real, and they come from people, from their problems, their pain. When someone takes on the burdens of others, when they care too much, these things are born. They feed on that energy. They show up when someone becomes too soft, too empathetic, too consumed by carrying others' problems as their own." Clara blinked, struggling to process his words. The absurdity of it all clashed with the reality she'd just witnessed. "You're saying, they're here because I cared? Because I've been worried about other people?" Her voice was uncertain, almost desperate. Michael nodded, but he wasn't done. "These entities thrive on that energy, your empathy. You've been taking on too much. You've been feeling everyone's pain as if it were your own. The more you care, the more they grow. It's an ancient force that feeds on human emotions to survive." Clara stood there, stunned. Her mind raced, trying to piece everything together. All those moments, those times she worried for her friends, her family, tried to help everyone she could, it all felt like it had led to this. Somehow, she'd unintentionally opened a door for these creatures to exist. "So, you're saying this is my fault?" Her voice cracked with despair. Michael raised a hand as if to calm her. "No, Clara, it's not your fault. This happens when someone carries too much of other people's pain. It's not a mistake. It's just how it works. But now that you know, you need to learn how to control it. We all make this mistake, taking on things we shouldn't. The key is knowing when to stop." He stood and walked closer to her, his expression serious, almost apologetic. "You're not to blame, but now you need to be ready to handle what comes next. These entities won't disappear forever. They'll try to come back unless you learn to protect your own energy." Clara felt her body tremble again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was the weight of everything she'd just learned. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was something far more terrifying. She was a part of this now, and her life would never be the same. How do I learn?" Her voice was quiet but resolute. Michael hesitated for a moment before answering. We'll figure it out. But the first step is learning to let go. To stop carrying other people's burdens as if they're your own. You have to learn how to be there for others without absorbing their pain. It's hard, but you can do it. We'll work on it. Clara looked at him, her heart still racing, but with every beat, it felt a little easier to bear. She knew there was a long road ahead, but at least now she had someone who understood how to fight this darkness, and she was ready to take the next step. After everything that had happened in the last few days, Clara sat on the old leather couch, gazing out the window, trying to make sense of what had gone down. Outside, it was a clear evening in Los Angeles, and the world seemed oblivious to the chaos inside her mind. She still felt a slight tremor in her hands, even though the entities they had dealt with were gone. Clara knew this wasn't the end. No, this was just the beginning. Michael had been at her place for 2 days straight. He wasn't rushing to leave, knowing she needed time to process everything she had learned about herself and the world. A world that was much more mystical than she ever could have imagined. Now, he sat across from her, watching her carefully, knowing he had to help her figure out how to move forward. Finally, Clara spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost lost, as if she were trying to gather all her thoughts into one place. "You're right. I've always tried to be the one people could turn to for help." She paused, carefully choosing her words. "I thought that if I helped people, if I listened to their problems, I could somehow make the world a better place. But I never thought it could affect me, us." Michael nodded, his gaze softening, though it remained focused. "It's normal. We all want to help, Clara, but there's a line where helping turns into a burden, and then into destruction. You can't be everything to everyone. You can't carry others' suffering as if it's your own. People will always need support, and you can be there for them. But when you take on their pain, that's when you open the door for things like those entities." Clara sighed. Her mind was full of contradictions. She had always prided herself on being there for her friends, on being able to listen and support them. But now, all of that seemed so naive, like she hadn't realized the price of that empathy. "I've always thought if someone's hurting, I should be there," she whispered, almost inaudibly. I can't be cruel, Michael. I can't just say, 'Don't worry, it's not my problem.'" Michael looked at her, his gaze intense but full of strength. "You're not cruel, Clara, but you have to learn how to protect yourself. You can't be the savior for everyone. That's not your role. People have to learn to deal with their own problems. Your job is to be there, but not to absorb their burdens. You can't pour your energy into someone else's struggles without destroying yourself. That's what led to those entities." Clara nodded, but her thoughts were still a jumbled mess. Was she supposed to shut herself off from the world? Was she supposed to step back when someone needed help? Wasn't that selfish? "But how do I learn this?" she asked, her voice full of doubt. "How do I learn to say no? It's all so complicated. People need support." Michael smiled at her, but it wasn't the smile he'd given her throughout their friendship. This one was different. It held truth, knowledge, and experience. He knew she still couldn't see the full picture, and that she needed time to accept these new concepts. It's not easy. It takes effort, and it takes time. But you have to understand one thing. You don't have to be everything to everyone. You don't have to solve other people's problems, especially when they become too heavy for you. The key is learning to let go. Don't let other people's miseries consume your life. Redirect them to where they can actually get help. A therapist, a priest, friends, they're the ones who should be there when people face real struggles. You can't be the one carrying their pain, Clara. You deserve peace. She sat silently, taking in his words, feeling them slowly but steadily sink into her consciousness. It was hard, really hard, but she knew he was right. You make it sound like it's something simple. Like I can just start living differently. What if I can't? Her voice was quiet but full of deep concern. Michael leaned back, resting against the back of the chair, and his expression grew even more serious. This isn't an easy fix, Clara, but it's the only way. If you keep taking on other people's problems, you'll face that evil again. Those entities won't go away unless you learn to protect yourself. You'll be strong, not because you'll be indifferent, but because you'll understand when your help is truly needed, and when you're at risk of destroying yourself and the people you're trying to help. Your goal is to learn to be support, not a sponge for other people's pain." She paused, letting his words sink in, then spoke again. "So what do I do? How exactly do I protect myself?" Michael stood and walked over to the table where a glass of water was sitting. He poured some into the glass and came back to her, standing in front of her like a teacher before a student. "We'll start small. First, you need to learn how to protect your energy. When you're talking to someone who's going through something, don't take their emotions on as your own. You can listen, you can support, but don't take on their pain. Second, learn to say no. That doesn't mean you don't want to help, it means you're protecting yourself and your soul. And third, if you feel like a situation is spiraling out of control, redirect that person to a professional. A therapist, a priest, even a coach. Those are the people who can really help them deal." Clara felt her shoulders start to relax a little. These words were a revelation to her. Of course, she knew she had to take care of herself, but she had never thought of it as a necessity for survival. "I'll try," she said quietly, but with resolve in her voice. Michael smiled and placed his hand on her shoulder, as if affirming her decision. "It's gonna be tough, but you can do it. You're stronger than you think, Clara. And remember, your strength isn't in being everything to everyone, it's in being able to be yourself and protect your soul." She looked at him, and in her eyes reflected a new determination. This was just the first step, but she felt ready to begin a new chapter in her life. The lessons in protection weren't just important for fighting mystical forces, but for keeping her soul safe in this world. When the door closed behind Michael, Clara stood in the hallway, wrapped in silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that something important had just happened, but at the same time, nothing had been explained. Everything felt so strange. Michael was gone, and with him, the threat that had been hanging in the air seemed to vanish. But now, her world was different. What he had said about boundaries kept echoing in her head, like a mantra, intensifying with every repeat, making her feel like she was on the brink of something much bigger. She slowly made her way back to the kitchen, where her cup of cold tea had been sitting, forgotten on the table. Clara sat down and ran her fingers over the old wood. Inside her, something stirred, like a new layer of reality had just appeared in her life. But how? Who was Michael? And what other hidden forces could be threatening her life? A quiet knock at the door broke her out of her thoughts. Clara got up, not expecting anyone, and when she opened it, she saw a middle-aged man standing on the doorstep with an air of confidence. He was tall, with short-cropped hair and a penetrating gaze. A slight smile on his face gave nothing away, neither joy nor concern. "Hello, Miss Larson," he said with a distinct American accent. "I'm James, the electrician. I was told you needed your system checked. It'll take no more than 20 minutes. Clara squinted at him, studying the stranger. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his words. He was clearly here for a specific reason. "But I didn't order an electrician," she said, trying to calm the growing sense of unease. She remembered that, in fact, her electrical system didn't need any repairs. He just stood there, not trying to explain, and his gaze remained focused and mysterious. Nothing about his behavior suggested he was here for a routine job like the other electricians she had met before. "Don't worry," James said, noticing her confusion. "I know what's going on. You've been having issues with your energy field. You should trust me." Her heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Just yesterday, her life had been normal, and now she was dealing with mysteries so strange that she couldn't tell if she was living in reality or something supernatural. I don't understand. What do you mean?" Her voice sounded almost panicked, but she couldn't stop herself from asking. Her intuition told her this was important. James stepped inside without waiting for permission, and Clara instinctively stepped aside, despite her nervousness. He wasn't like the other people she had met. His eyes weren't just human, they were full of something ancient and powerful. "You see," he began, ignoring her tension. "You met Michael, right? He's not an ordinary guy. Neither am I. We came here to help you. But not all of us work the same way. He could have handled this quickly and painlessly, but there are things you need to figure out for yourself. Before we leave, we need to clear something up." He walked over to the electrical panel, not asking for permission. Clara, still nervous, couldn't make sense of what was going on. Why was she in a situation where the world around her felt so foreign and terrifying? "Wait, what are you doing?" she asked weakly, but James seemed not to hear her. "Michael was right. You've opened doors to something bigger than just an energy threat. When you took on others' problems, you became vulnerable. Not just to people's emotions, but to entities that feed on them. They leave a mark that's hard to get rid of. Both Michael and I are here to clean up the aftermath. But if you want to keep your world safe, you need to learn to hold your boundaries. Otherwise, nothing will save you." He finished working with the electricity as if nothing unusual had happened. Then he turned back to her, and his eyes had softened, becoming calmer. "But," he continued, "that's not all. You'll need to learn to protect not just your energy, but also how to fight things that are invisible to ordinary people." Clara stood there, feeling as if she were in a fog, her mind struggling to make sense of everything. Michael's words about protecting her soul and James's warning about her vulnerability were spinning around in her head. This wasn't just a lesson or some kind of mental health training. This was a real battle against unseen evil. "And what now?" she asked, trying to find some explanation for what had just happened. "We're leaving," James said, as if nothing had happened. "But if you don't keep your boundaries in check, I'll be back. Michael too. And next time, things will be worse." Clara felt the tension finally ease. James stepped toward the door and, without another word, disappeared through it, leaving her standing in the hallway. When the door closed, Clara stood in the silence, feeling a shift inside her. It was as if this moment was part of something much bigger. She looked around. No, she didn't need to understand everything right now. The important thing was that her life was under control again. But she knew one thing. This story wasn't over. Michael, James, the entities, they were all part of a new reality that she would have to understand. And if she didn't learn to protect her soul, everything could happen again.